shape of the letter, and I just don't remember what it's called. I mean, I've got like I know that if it's like 200,
The day before.
March 1990.
It's given at the chapel same as happy birthday.
I mean, just my experience. I don't know.
After the service, we're gonna have a bunch of cupcakes made by him.
I'm on the same floor as learning everything along with you.
and you know, even sometimes it is a bit more challenging. It's tough to do this when you're sure it runs. However, it could run with a lot less. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hello to you all online. I didn't say good morning to them this time. Hello to you all online. Actually, somebody mind closing that door? Make sure that we're not bothering them or they're not bothering us. Thank you, sir. Good to see you all. We're picking up where we left off with biblical criticism today. And my hope is to really have that sort of sealed up in the next hour and 10 minutes so that on Monday morning or Tuesday morning of next week, we can just jump right into talking about Scripture. Fun part, right? Well, we're doing that today, sort of, but we're going to look at passages of Scripture in detail every week, every class, starting Tuesday, so I'm excited about that. There's one sort of clarification I wanted to make about the historical criticism thing that we talked about in the last class. Because I mentioned, for example, that there are scholars who, texts like Matthew will talk not only about the history in the text, meaning the writer's description of Jesus and his disciples and what they did and said in their ministry, but that there is then the history behind the text, meaning the conditions of the writer as the writer is writing the text and how that might have influenced the way they told the story. And I mean, you'll find if you've already started my book that I do very briefly address that in the very beginning of the book, and you'll find that for Matthew anyway, I don't think we need to play that game to interpret it well. So it goes back to like Sam's question from the other day about clarity. To me, Matthew is clear without having to play that game. So I didn't necessarily go into my own level of agreement or disagreement with that because I think you all should be free to sort of look at that and play with the idea and wonder if it's helpful or not. I personally, for a text like Matthew, all the Gospels really don't think we need to worry about those sort of possible embedded cultural contexts of the writer at the time. I think those texts are clear enough on their own without that. But I wanted to bring it back to that because that was the example I gave, and it does raise those questions that Sam raised. But there are other texts where it's not really actually a question, and it absolutely matters that you look at the story behind the text. But most scholars would say that that's most important in Paul's letters, and that's standard of any reading of Paul, that you're not going... So, for example, in Galatians, Paul mentions things of the historical past, like he brings up Abraham, or he talks about the Deuteronomic curses, or whatever. That's Paul engaging with what is to him already past. But there's also a condition, a situation within the context of the community to whom Paul writes that dictates why he then says what he says about Abraham. Does that make sense? And here's a really great example of that. And I had a THM student last year write a very good paper on this. Paul only really engages deeply with Abraham in 2 letters, Galatians and Romans. And there's a few similarities between the ways that he does that in those 2 letters and a few very sharp differences. So why are there differences? Why is he talking about Abraham one way in Galatians and somewhat differently in Romans? It's because the thing he's trying to address within the embedded current moment dictates then how he has to talk about history. So his goal in both of those letters is not just a general theological observation about Abraham. It's very particular observations about Abraham that are dictated by the moment he's trying to address within the text itself and to the community to whom he writes. Does that make sense? So that, I think, the history, I didn't mention it that way, but some of these texts, it's absolutely the right thing to do, to say what's going on not only in this text, but behind it. And there are a lot of debates about that. Mark Nanos edited a book called the Galatians Debate, which is like a 500-page book with an edited volume with chapters by various scholars arguing about just that point. Like, what exactly is the problem in Galatia? Who are Paul's opponents? What is he exactly trying to address here? And it's not really as open shut case as you might think. There's a lot of nuance there that could change the way you read certain pieces of the letter. So in something like Paul's letters, that sort of thing absolutely matters. Where again, with the Gospels, it's more debatable, and my suggestion is that it probably does not matter a whole lot what Matthew's community is going through as he writes that gospel. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. I'm saying it. I mean, Matthew clearly existed within a community of some sort, right? And still had his own experiences that made its way into the text. But my thing is, these are still biographies of Jesus, and I don't think the gospel writers went out of their way to embed themselves in sort of coded fashion into those texts, right? But again, you're free to disagree with that. I'm just right. From one text to the next, even this question needs to be thought about and addressed somewhat differently, I would say. And in Paul's letters, it's more the case that he's like a pastor, like I said last time, a pastor putting out fires, and the fires he's trying to put out really actually do matter for how you read his letters. Also, Sam mentioned the idea of the clarity of Scripture, and I think that there's even a layer to that that's important, because these things would have been much more clear, quite clear, I think, in a lot of ways, to the original audience. Like when the Roman Church received Romans, and it's been sort of a recent trend in Pauline scholarship that Romans is now being read not so much as just a general theological treatise, but it also has its own very particular things Paul's addressing relevant to that community. Like there are things the Roman Church was going through that other churches in the Roman Empire probably weren't, and you can tell that those things are being discussed by Paul meaningfully for that reason. But when they received that letter, it would have been much clearer to the original audience than it might be to us. As it's been said many times before, the past is a foreign country, right? Like Scotland, in many ways, is quite similar to the United States because we share a language, sort of, depending on where in Scotland you are. We share a language, and some of our cultural customs are similar, and yet still, when I moved there were things where it took us months to get used to certain things where we were like, what is going on? Why do they do this way or that way, right? And then moved to Ireland, which is quite similar again, but still certain idiosyncrasies. And then I moved to Belgium, which is wildly different than the US or Scotland or Ireland. Reading these texts can sort of be like that in the sense that we're talking about a distance of 2,000 years. And so I believe in the doctrine of the clarity of Scripture, but what we mean by that, right? Like it's still, that's why I said last time that I believe it's still very hard work actually to read the Bible well. Because we're sort of having to place ourselves within a 2,000-year-old milieu to understand exactly what they would have thought of when they read this stuff. And only when we started on Revelation, well, I'm going to get very started on that this afternoon for the few of you in this class that are also in that class. Revelation very much to me, even to the group at the time, might have had a difficult time sifting through it, but they were more trained in apocalyptic literature and what it was and how it functioned and how to read it back then than we are now. We're so far removed from a culture in which that's normal. Right? This afternoon with that class, I'm going to mention, for example, the Branch Davidians. Most of us probably know who that is. It's the group in Waco, Texas that were essentially set on fire and slaughtered by the FBI. Their entire community, this like cult-like community in Waco, Texas, 1993, was entirely dictated by these bizarre readings of the book of Revelation that literally led them to their deaths, right? So Revelation can be a very confusing text, actually, depending on how you look at it and how you read it. And so, yeah, I think I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with this, that some of these texts, this kind of history behind the text might not be a great approach, and some of them it's a necessary approach. And I think Paul's letters would be the one place where I would say more than any other, it's pretty necessary to figure out what's going on in the community to whom he writes so that you can read it well. So. All right. Redaction criticism. We talked about that as well, right? That's like editing, sort of like how writers are editing pieces of their texts depending on what their goals are. Narrative goals is pretty necessary for that. We talked about the Beatitude, for example, blessed are the poor versus blessed are the poor in spirit. Literary criticism, that's the next one. This focuses on a text as a piece of writing. So like a closed literary unit. You could also read the whole Bible this way. We're going to get to that at the end of our time, but that's called canonical criticism. But if you look at an individual text as a closed literary unit, it seeks to evaluate various aspects of the language and content of the text, not from a historical standpoint, so not looking behind the text at what's going on, but by understanding the structure and arrangement of the material and the intertextuality and the internal logic of the stories and the arguments within the text itself. We're going to spend a lot of time on this next week, so I'm not going to spoil too much of it, but I'm going to give you a great example of this right at the very beginning of our time next week, where Matthew begins, let me finish this thought, I'll go right to you. Matthew begins his gospel with that this is the genesis of, or record of, or beginning of Jesus the Messiah. I say all that because there's various ways to translate that word. This is the genesis of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. Why? Not only is it important that Matthew only indicates son of David and Abraham and not others. He could have named lots of other people. But you might notice that David and Abraham's names chronologically are reversed. He names David first and Abraham second, even though they appeared in history in opposite order. And I would argue, and do argue, and lots of scholars of Matthew have argued this, that not only is it very important to the literary structure of Matthew's gospel that he names those two people in particular in the very first verse, but it's important to the literary structure that he names them in opposite order. He names David first because he deals with David's significance first in the literary flow of the text. He names Abraham second because he then deals with Abraham's significance to the Christian community after he deals with David in the literary flow of the text. So there's all sorts of stuff as you move along about Jesus' Davidic identity. And then only as you get towards the end of Matthew does the Abrahamic promise come in a very prominent way. So he deals with it in the same order that he starts it with in the very first verse. That's a literary observation. Historically, it's actually odd because David's name shouldn't come first, Abraham's should. But literarily then it makes sense because Matthew's gospel is structured in a way that necessitates that he start his gospel in that manner. So that's what literary criticism is in short. It's just how is this text as a contained world, right? Think of it as a world. Like, sci-fi movie, you end up on a new planet and you're looking around and thinking, okay, how do we navigate this and figure out what this space is like? What about the flora and the fauna? And is everything going to try to kill me? Is this just like Australia on a planetary scale? You're thinking about how to enter into and observe that world for its own sake. Literary criticism is doing that in a text. Now, literary criticism is a great way to do it, but it also, to some degree, to do this well, it requires that you then remain contained within that text and resist the urge to be over-influenced by reading something in that text through things outside of it that you're trying to import into it, right? Like think about taking an insect that doesn't belong in an environment and then dumping a bucket of them into that environment. They're going to actually wreak havoc and cause problems. And I think we do that with biblical passages a lot, where we bring a passage into another context where it doesn't fit well and we try to make it fit because it preaches well or whatever. But then it wreaks havoc on our ability to understand that text well because the writer wasn't maybe thinking of that verse that you're now thinking of, and it's like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't fit all that well. Now you can bring, in literary criticism, you can bring things in from the outside if the writer intends you to. Right? That's intertextuality. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail as we move along through the semester. But like in Matthew, for example, Matthew himself, the writer, quotes Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I have called my son. But in Hosea 11:1, it's talking about Israel, and Matthew reappropriates it to talk about Jesus himself. But it's still a direct quote from Hosea. So that's bringing in Hosea into the environment of Matthew, but you're doing it appropriately because Matthew wants you to, because he quoted it. Does that make sense? And then Jesus himself also quotes Hosea, possibly my single favorite verse of the entire Bible, is Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6 twice, and he does it only in Matthew. When he says, go and learn what this means. And by the way, if Jesus says, go and learn what this means, you should go and learn what that means. Right? He doesn't start any other sentence that way in all of Jesus' teaching. Only in one thing does he say, go and learn what this means. And he says it twice, and he then quotes Hosea 6:6 both times, meaning he really wants everyone to learn that verse. And it's, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So Jesus himself then wants you to leave Matthew's contained unit to go to Hosea, because he's quoting Hosea. So to go and learn Hosea well, so that you can go back to what Jesus says and figure out why he says it, makes perfect sense. So literary criticism does allow you to exit your contained unit and go into other worlds, but only if they're already being brought into the ecosystem of that text by the writer or the speaker in Jesus's case or whatever. Right? So that's literary criticism. How does this narrative of this book work as a contained unit, and what can it tell me? You'll see when you read my Beatitudes book for this class that that's how I read the Beatitudes. I try to explain every Beatitude by things being talked about in other places in Matthew's Gospel, and I try not to leave the Gospel to explain the Beatitudes unless the Beatitudes themselves tip me off to do that. So in my book, I talk about Isaiah 61 because the Beatitudes quote Isaiah 61. I talk about Psalm 37 because the Beatitudes quote Psalm 37. But other than that, when I want to describe what mourning is all about, I'm looking at where mourning happens in Matthew to explain what that Beatitude means. I don't just define mourning as wildly and widely as I possibly can and then go, well, it probably means all this stuff. Well, how do we know? But if there's examples of mourning within the text where the verse is found, then I can be more confident probably that that's what that means, right? So that's what literary criticism is all about. So again, great approach to reading our texts. And then sidebar, this might be an approach you might take with a research paper. Another good example of this, I had a really good paper that was done where Mark is really vague about the meaning of the crucifixion. And actually, we might talk about this verse in class later on, but depending on how much time we have. Mark is very vague about, he's very explicit about the crucifixion, but he's very vague about what it means. But he does refer to it as a ransom and does not explain what he means by ransom. So I had a student who that was their method. My method is I'm going to try to use the Gospel of Mark itself as a contained unit to describe what Mark then probably meant by referring to Jesus's crucifixion as a ransom. And she kept her whole paper within the text of Mark itself and tried to explain that one single use of that one word through Mark's overall narrative. And she did a really good job. So that's the kind of thing you might be thinking about. Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the back PowerPoint's gone out.
What's that?
Projector.
Oh, did the back screen go out? Oh.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know how to fix that. Are you guys good with the side screens, or do we really need, do you think, that one?
I just don't know about
It's
the
okay.
online.
Online, they'll still see it because they don't see that.
Okay.
The stuff from the screens gets put onto their screen, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they should still be fine, yeah. I'm glad you're thinking of them. Yeah, very good. All right, yeah. So I don't know exactly, I mean, with the other rooms, it's a TV, and usually if this happens, it's because it's just not on. That's easy, just push the button. I don't know how to get that particular screen back on right now. We'd have to pause and go get IT, and I'd rather keep going if we can. Yeah.
So maybe this is, I guess, more of a, well, no, Western European, or maybe just because I've read too many fantasy books in my youth. But, I mean, to me, like, your comment about, like, naming David first and Abraham, that makes, at least in my brain, that makes sense, because usually when you read stuff, it's like, so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and it's like their father before them, blah, blah, blah. So it is that, like, I guess, inverse chronology, because, you know, you're going, like, youngest to farthest back ancestors. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, is that just, like,
It's a good inclination. The only issue with that, though, is that then Matthew then jumps from the first verse into a genealogy and starts at the beginning, not reverse. So he's only reversed with the first two names, but then when he goes into the genealogy, he starts at the beginning. He doesn't go to the end and go backwards like he does with David and Abraham.
Yeah.
He starts with Abraham and then goes forward to David. So his own style of doing a genealogy is not to do it that way.
Yeah.
So that's why scholars are more convinced that he reverses their names for narrative
Okay.
reasons.
yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah. And actually, we're going to spend, this might sound dull, but I hope it's not going to be. I've been told by other students in this class in the past that it's not, so hopefully. But we're going to actually spend a lot of time on that genealogy, because there are ways that Matthew is embedding into the entire genealogy all sorts of fascinating things about the nature of Jesus' identity as the Davidic king
and what it means for him to be a Davidic king and all of that. So we're going to walk through weird details in the genealogy for an entire class session. So I think that'll be fun. We'll see. All right, reception history. I mentioned this when Sam was here, and I do think this is a good approach, and I'm happy for any of you to choose to take it in a research paper. And if you read books on reception history, I think the good ones are fantastic. They're very fascinating. But for a short research paper, it can be difficult to do this well. But a reception history, and this is a recent trend in scholarship, mostly over the last 30 years or so, it focuses on the analyzation not in the text or behind the text, but in front of it. Meaning, how has the text been read and used and received throughout the history of the church? And every time I've ever had a student do a reception history, their conclusion is always how shocked they are at how very divergent church history is on just about everything. Which, by the way, and again, I always maybe sound like I'm being critical of preachers, and I was a pastor 8 years. I definitely don't want to do that. But I do think all of us, if we're going to be, a good number of you, 60, 70% of you are going to be pastors. I always think it's important to still point out ways that we need to be maybe a bit more careful than pastors tend to be. Pastors often say, well, if you're reading this text differently than the whole church has read it, then maybe you're wrong. But the whole church has not been monolithic in its reading of virtually anything. It's almost always wrong. I say almost because it's not always wrong. There are times where it's true. It's almost always wrong to say the church has always believed one thing about any passage. So Rebecca Eklund wrote a reception history on the Beatitudes and details something like 15 entirely different models for reading that text. Not just little small interpretive things that are insignificant, entirely divergent models for reading the unit. And there's like 15 different ones throughout the history of the church. Some of them are in sharp, complete opposition to each other. Like you could not reconcile them, right? So there are lots of passages that seem like they might be sort of a smooth text to read that just aren't. Like reception histories, every time they dig this stuff up and they're like, wow, there are some wild ways people have read these texts in the past. And that's true of most passages. So a reception history in that sense can be enlightening, it can be fascinating, it can be just really engaging. Here's the tough part. For a short paper of 3,500 to 4,000 words, you'd have to pick a text that you want to do a reception history on. And you'd have to pick your, what they call interlocutors, your conversation partners, very carefully. Like you can maybe pick 2 people from the early church that commented on that text, like 1 or 2 medieval theologians or scholars, maybe a couple of Reformation people, and 1 or 2 current. I mean, you'd have to really strip it down to like maybe 2 in each age, or even skip the medieval period. I don't like to do that because that's the trend of Christianity, is to just look at the medieval period as though none of them had anything interesting to say, and that's not true. But if you even went from like early church to Reformation to the current, to keep it to like maybe 6 voices, that's about all you could fit into a 3,500 word paper. But it can still, if you do it well, it can be a really enlightening way to approach a text.
Could you do the same thing, but like within a specific era, like say the Reformation, or is that a different type of criticism?
100%. I'd be absolutely happy with somebody to do that, and it would give you way more freedom to do that. And that still sort of fits into reception history. If you wanted to simply say, here's a text that was debated in the Reformation. Now, again, this is not a historical theology class, so you'd have to still show in your paper that your goal is to understand the text better. Like your goal of this class is not to understand the Reformation better. That's a different class. This is not church history, right? So if your goal is because you want to know more about the Reformation itself, then that's a great paper for a different class. The difficult thing there would be, if you're doing a reception history, the goal of reception history for this class is still to understand the text of the New Testament better, not that historical period better, right? But if you want to pick a single period, and you could do that with the early church as well. Like, oh, I found 5 church fathers who all talked about this text, but there was a little bit of a debate about what they thought it meant at the time, and that was your whole paper, was here's what they all said, and now here's how I break that text down and who I side with and why. I think that's actually a really good idea. Yeah, that can be done really well. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's reception history. It's a simple idea, simple concept, but they're a lot of fun. A few things about why I think reception history is good. First, it opens up new possibilities of interpretation. Again, by seeing the way something's been read that maybe you've never thought about before. It helps us to resist what's called chronological snobbery, This is not so much a problem, thankfully, in the church, but it is a big problem in the academy, where the academy is enamored with only people who have said something about that text in the last 30 years, as if everything old suddenly doesn't matter anymore. And some of the most insightful things written about biblical texts have been written throughout the whole history of the church, from the very beginning on to today. And so to avoid this recency bias, it says, oh, only what we know now matters. Reception history helps to remind us all that the whole history of the church has a lot of really wonderful things to offer about reading the Bible well. And then the third one, it embeds us into our interpretive traditions in a lot of ways as well, because we simply learn more about them by doing something like this. Yeah. All right, form criticism. This one's fun because it was really, really fancy, and everyone was enamored with it in the 40s and 50s, and then everyone got tired of it and ignored it for decades, and it's sort of, in some circles, starting to make a small comeback. But form criticism essentially focuses on the form and function of smaller units of text. So not necessarily a whole genre of a text. So if you look at like the Gospels, they are Greco-Roman style biographies of Jesus. Some people like to call them paradigmatic biographies because they're biographies with an intention to teach something theological, which is not normal for a biography in the ancient world, but they're still structured like a normal ancient Greco-Roman biography. So that would be a genre of that whole text. But what about what you can call embedded genres within the text? Matthew might be a Greco-Roman biography of Jesus, but within it, it has parables and its own versions of things like Psalms or miracle stories, birth stories, whatever, that also as smaller units need to be interpreted within light of that individual unit. And each individual unit of a type of a text requires its own interpretive strategy. You do not read a speech the way that you read a parable. You shouldn't. They're not similar enough to read them exactly the same way. You have to adjust to the embedded genre of these tiny units. So it seeks to understand what is often in biblical studies called the Sitz im Leben. You might have seen that phrase when you read and think, what in the world does that mean? It just means the situation in life that brought about certain forms and the connections between form and content. So why did we go from no apocalypses existing to suddenly quite a few of them existing in a very short period of time? A lot of scholars believe that apocalyptic literature is a form of resistance literature. So there was a particular situation, circumstances, where religious believers, followers of God, came into a more concentrated conflict with the state than had previously been the case. And apocalyptic literature was one of their many responses to those conflicts. So situations in life bring about the existence of texts that might not have even existed beforehand. And that also can be true of smaller little units and things like that. So while historical criticism seeks to establish the background of a text, form criticism is more concerned not with its background, but how it's structured and how it's used, right? How is this little unit used? So if you want to do a paper on a parable, you're going to have to be very careful to understand what a parable is and how it works, because you're not going to read it well if you don't. Here's one, I'm going to give you one really good, I think, quick example of a recent approach to this that I find so fascinating. So there's a scholar in Norway, he's an American guy, did his doctorate at Notre Dame, but he teaches at a college in Norway, Justin David Strong, who wrote a book called The Fables of Jesus. And you might think, when did Jesus use fables? Well, his argument, it's a provocative title because he's basically comparing Jesus's parables to ancient Greek fables in a way they'd never been compared before, because scholars sort of for decades assumed they were just too different. But his thing was actually they're not as different as people think, because you have to look at the form of both to see that they're quite similar. The form of an ancient Greek fable and the form of Jesus's parables actually share a ton in common. And it's only when he noticed that and started to look at the similarities that he looked closer at those fables and found fables that actually begin exactly the same way as some of Jesus's parables. So then he started to compare them more closely. And here, to me, is my favorite one. It's a very long book. It's like 600 pages of him doing this. So I'll just give you the one that I think is the most fascinating. He actually found two ancient Greek fables that predate Jesus by a couple of centuries, but that were popular at the time and would have been well known, probably even to Jesus' own audience. He found two fables that begin the exact same way as the parable of the prodigal son. Son goes to the father, Dad, I don't want to be here anymore. You bore me. Give me what's mine. Give me my future inheritance. I'm out of here. So these two fables begin exactly that way. Son goes to the dad, wants his money. Father warns him. Grass isn't always greener, but sure. Here's your future inheritance. Godspeed. Son takes the money. He's excited. He takes off, leaves the family home. He's out on his own, squanders the money. But in both of those Greek fables, the son ends up poor, cold, and alone. And then the fable just ends both times. Why? Because the function of the form criticism, the function of the form of the ancient Greek fables, they were moral tales told to children to warn them about behavior that will lead to their ruin. And they were essentially a way of saying, hey, even if you don't like dad's rules, trust dad, he knows better than you. You're an idiot child. One day you'll get it, but until then, so the fables were like warnings that if you don't trust dad and if you go out on your own and think you know better, it's not going to end well for you. So that's all they were. They were moral tales. So, Jesus, crowd full of people. A son once went to his dad and said, Dad, give me my future inheritance. And what is all the crowd? Oh, okay, Jesus, we've heard this. We all know these fables. We all know, okay, listen to our fathers. Don't, right. And Jesus is like, wait, right? So then he gets to the point where the prodigal son is broke, cold, and alone. And then he just keeps telling a story. And they're all like, wait a minute, that's the end. What are you doing, Jesus? But he's like halfway through. And then he goes on this whole second half of the story that was not at all involved in the other two versions about the forgiveness of the father, welcoming the son home, killing the fattened calf, throwing a big party. The grace of God becomes Jesus's point, which would have been an entirely shocking surprise when they heard him tell that story. So it's not that Jesus' story was entirely unique, like people often thought. It's that it was entirely unique in a context in which they would have already thought of and known the beginning of the story. It's the second half that was unique that would have just blown their minds. Because Jesus is saying something about the grace of God that they never would have thought about it quite that way, right? Form criticism led Justin David Strong to these evaluations, and I think they're beautiful. And to me, ever since I read his book, I've never read the parable of the prodigal son the same way, right? That kind of thing is what form criticism is used for. How is the form of this function? How do we compare it to other things with a similar form? That sort of thing. All right. Tradition criticism seeks to understand the ways that early Christians passed on traditions about Jesus and their systems of belief and the examples of these traditions detectable in the Bible itself. How did the earliest Jesus followers transmit stories, creeds, codes of conduct, songs, hymns, etc.? And to what degree were these traditions variable? How much variation might have been accepted by other Christ-following communities? We already showed an example of this with 1 Corinthians, right? I showed you how in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul starts by saying, what I received, I am handing on to you as a matter of first importance. That's tradition criticism. It's developing an understanding of what these core things are in the early church that they taught and believed and passed around before the stuff even began to be written down. Philippians 2:6-11, Sam mentioned this very briefly in his time here the other day. There's a big ongoing decades-long debate about that passage because a lot of scholars believe that Philippians 2:6-11 was a hymn that was sung in the early church before Paul wrote Philippians, so not written by him, and that Paul simply took the hymn because it fit what he was saying, and he stitched the hymn into his argument. But there's a debate about whether that's true or not. Some think that because it does just wildly structurally look like a hymn, where everything before and after it doesn't. But it also shares enough linguistic similarities to what Paul is doing that it does still kind of read Pauline in some ways. Some then say, well, maybe it was a hymn and that's why it looks that way, but Paul reworded it a tad to make it fit his argument or whatever. There's a whole debate about this. Some find this wildly uninteresting because ultimately whether that's a hymn or not doesn't affect the way we read it probably. But other people, especially if they're just interested in patterns of worship in the early church, find that to be a very interesting question. Right? So just thinking through then how these traditions might have developed and fit their way into other passages throughout the New Testament is what tradition criticism is really trying to accomplish. So, it does become important. This question becomes important when we think about, historians often just want to ask, what were the core beliefs of the earliest church? Like, what were the things that mattered to them the most? And you can use this approach to try to crack that nut and see if you can figure it out. But again, of all the ones I'm showing you, this is the one I think might have the least benefit to interpreting texts themselves. It's more of a historical question that some people find interesting. And the Sermon on the Mount, I mentioned that the other day. That's a debate about that as well. Like John Calvin, he thought that the Sermon on the Mount was actually a bunch of individual things Jesus said in different sermons, and that the gospel writer constructed them into a sermon and then gave them a setting. So why the Mount? Why then would you give the setting of the Mount? Well, Moses gave the law on a mount. Jesus preaches the Sermon of the Mount on a mount. The entire first 5 chapters of Matthew are littered with Moses typology. So then the mountain setting just adds to the ongoing Moses typology of the ways that Jesus becomes the newer, better Moses. Right? That kind of thing. All right, canonical criticism views the text entirely, meaning not an individual text like literary criticism, but the Bible. Views the Bible entirely as a finished theological product. Many other forms of criticism are ignored or minimized, like historical criticism or redaction criticism. And even the intention of the writer and his own background is somewhat irrelevant. The canon, then, is one unity, and differences between books are somewhat minimized. I say somewhat because you still have to be careful with this, but I'll explain that in a minute. The New Testament, then, is a single story with a unified theological outlook, and different traditions with different canons would be forced to come to different conclusions. Meanings of texts are derived from the interaction with other texts. The Psalms are a good example of this because the Psalm book itself is thought of as kind of a canon within the canon. But the Psalm book, the individual Psalms, were written by different writers in different times with different contexts and different purposes. But when the Psalm book was assembled as a book, it was assembled in a way where there is a continuity to it, where it can be used and thought of as kind of a unit with a theological flow to it. And there are Psalm scholars who write books and explain how that works, why it works that way. So they're read often with no interest for their historical context, right? How often do we really, really, really know who wrote this psalm, exactly what year did they write it, and what was going on when they wrote it, and why? Sometimes it's easier to tell. Sometimes, like, a Psalm of David will have some clear indicators of what might be going on, but a lot of the time it's guesswork. It's like, well, this kind of sounds like a psalm that would have been written during the exile, maybe. But how sure can you be? You can't. But does the psalm still feed the soul? Absolutely. So, right, there is a degree to which sometimes in some texts, the background gets minimized because the theological reading is fruitful enough. Now, I said last week that we should avoid these wildly, broadly theological topics. And I do mean that. And so here's why I think canonical criticism could work for this class and what I'm trying to address with this in particular. Canonical criticism does not mean pick a broad theological topic and just pluck verses out of the whole Bible to try and support your theological topic. It doesn't mean like, oh, what does the whole Bible have to say about, this one about circumcision? And then you're just plucking verses about circumcision from the whole Bible out of their context, and then it gets jumbled, and you can't be careful enough about how you're utilizing each text and whatever. Canonical criticism is more about the narrative of the Bible and making connections to the grand story of it. And here, to me, is the biggest narrative way you can probably do that. And I bring this one up because I had a student who did it my first year here at Calvin. Which, by the way, he has offered. He got a strong A-, so it's okay for me to tell you it was an A-, and not an A. He got a strong A-, so it was very well done. He has offered me to allow people to read this paper if anybody wants to read it, not just as an example of canonical criticism, but an example of just a paper that did pretty well in this class. So if anybody ever was like, hey, I'd like to read an example, this was like a year ago, he was like, oh, if students ever want to read my paper, I'm okay with it, but I'm sure he'd still be okay with it. My wife is his boss now, so I think he'll be okay with it. I'm over here strong-arming people.
Yeah.
No, he's a good dude. So anyway, he wrote a paper about, he talked about sort of Eden, the prophecy of a coming recreation of the heavens and the earth, and then the new Eden. So Eden, Genesis. The new heavens and the new earth, Isaiah 65 and 66. And then the creation of a new Edenic reality in the realization of the new heavens and new earth at the very end of Revelation. So his thing is, we have the very beginning, the creation of Eden, and the very end, the recreation of a new Eden. And he noticed that dead in the center of the Bible in Isaiah 65, 66 is a prophecy that was hoped for and expected. In other words, in Isaiah, there's a realization that the original Edenic creation failed, and a hope that it will be reconstituted at a future point. So he used those three passages as a way to tell a broad story about creation, destruction, promise, and recreation of the Edenic concept. That's a canonical way where he's not necessarily taking into full account exactly the context of Genesis and Isaiah and Revelation, but telling a theological, canonically consistent story about how the whole Bible points to a reality, it's the conflict with that reality, and then the full fulfillment of a better version of that reality in the end, right? So that would be an example of how you could do that really well. This is hard to do because if you end up just wildly taking verses out of context to tell a story you're trying to tell, the paper's not going to go well, right? But that kind of thing is a little bit more clearly indicated in the flow of these texts, that's something they all, in the ancient world, Jews and Christians alike, were all looking at and longing for. So that would be canonical criticism. How does the whole Bible tell the story that I can tell or recreate through various passages from a broader theological perspective? Another important way to do this might just be thinking through the concept of God's presence, right? God was walking with them in the garden in the cool of the day. He's present with them. Then the fall happens, and they are removed not just from the Edenic reality, but the presence of God itself. Then you have God becoming re-present or newly present in the tabernacle and the temple. And then in Ezekiel 10, he leaves again, right? There's actually a vision of God's presence leaving the temple in Ezekiel 10 and abandoning them when they go into the exile. And then when Jesus comes, what does he say? Well, first of all, John 1 says he came to tabernacle among us. What's the tabernacle? The whole thing existed so God's presence could be with his people. And then what does Matthew 1 say? That he is Emmanuel. Nobody ever called him Emmanuel. His name is Jesus. So why does it say that you will call him Emmanuel? Because Emmanuel just means what? God with us. And then what does Jesus say in Matthew 28? Go with the mission. Why? Because I will be with you all to the end of the age. So the presence of God is a clearly articulated theological story across the whole canon of Scripture. He's present, they lose the presence. He's then newly present in a new but insufficient way, and they even then lose that. Then he comes back again in Jesus in another new version of a presence. But then what does Jesus say? I'm going to leave. It's like, oh, we've been back and forth with this presence of God thing quite a bit, haven't we? Right? It's like, you're here, then you're gone, then you're here, then you're gone. And he's like, it's your fault. Never mind. But then Jesus is like, well, now I'm going to leave. And they're like, again? But then what does he say? But I'm leaving you with another, the helper, the paraclete. And so then what is Pentecost? Another version of the revisiting of the presence of God. So this is a theme, a canonical theme that can very easily be developed. That one I'm saying now is quite large. It might not fit into a paper, but that's the sort of thing you can be thinking about. All right. I'm going to jump into intertextuality for a few minutes, but are there any questions about any of these models before I do that?
Regarding this model, since this is a New Testament class,
Yeah.
Is there permission when using this model to go to the Old Testament, or do you want us to try to keep that within the context of the New Testament?
Yeah, I mean, so this is definitely, you're using the whole Bible to do this, but it still fits in a New Testament class because the New Testament would be the consummation or fulfillment of whatever story you were trying to tell. So if you were doing canonical criticism on a theme that's only in the Old Testament and you never got to the New, then that would not work for this class. But yeah, any of the ones that I'm thinking of are trying to present presence of God or the Edenic reality or whatever, all of these have their fulfillment ultimately. Their truest realities come to full fruition in the New Testament context. So they would be, yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the Hebrew Bible in this class a lot. So, I mean, you can't do New Testament scholarship without doing a significant amount of stuff from the Hebrew Bible. I would even say this. There's three realities when reading and interpreting the Bible, the New Testament, that I think get ignored a lot, and they're three of the most important realities, and I see them ignored all the time. The first is the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 70 AD. To think through every time you read anything in the New Testament, when this was written, was the temple still standing or not? And if it wasn't still standing when this was written, does the destruction of the temple in the city of Jerusalem have any meaningful impact on how I read anything in this book? I mean, the entire dating and interpretation of the book of Hebrews literally hinges almost entirely on just that question. The scholars who believe that Hebrews was written before the destruction of the temple read the entire book somewhat differently than scholars who think it was written after the destruction of the temple. And modern scholars are essentially divided on that question. So if you ask a scholar, what's the sort of, how do you read the literary unit? How do you enter the literary world of Hebrews? And a lot of the time it's like, well, it depends. Do you think the temple was standing when the writer wrote it or not? And it just, the whole, right? And it hinges more on, that hinges on Hebrews more than on other texts maybe, but it's relevant to most texts. We'll talk about this in a few weeks for those of you in the Revelation class. There's a debate about whether the temple was still standing when Revelation was written or not. And it changes the way you read a couple passages. So that's question one. Question two, what is the relationship here between Jews and Gentiles? The Jewish-Gentile question is present in 80% of the stuff in the New Testament. It's, I mean, like to the degree that there are entire phrases in the New Testament that we, I think, interpret wrongly because we read them as universally applicable, when actually some of the writers were just very particularly dealing with dynamics between Jews and Gentiles when they wrote certain things. So unless you're thinking about, is this writer thinking about Jew-Gentile relations, unless you ask yourself that question, you're probably going to miss a lot. Because that question's not, it's very relevant to Paul, but it's quite relevant to Matthew, it's very relevant to Luke, it's pretty relevant to parts of Revelation. It can be very relevant to Hebrews depending on how you translate the one word in Hebrews, the word obsolete. So yeah, there's like, that question is just looms over all kinds of stuff, and we tend a lot of the time to like ignore it, right? But it's really important. And then the third one is intertextuality. Significantly more of the New Testament is engaging with the Hebrew Bible than we often think. So to your question, I would say you even can't do New Testament interpretation well unless you are dealing quite specifically and prolifically with the Hebrew Bible a lot. And I'm going to talk right now actually about kind of how it's the Hebrew Bible is present in the New Testament in ways we don't typically realize, and it leads to a lot of bad readings. So yeah, you definitely are, not only can you with this approach, but you're going to need to use both testaments to do it well, but that would be the hope, is that it would culminate in a meaningful discussion on how the New Testament fulfills that idea. Yeah.
So it's like, if you were to go about, say, writing like a paper using this method, is it like I pick a passage, find one of the themes that the passage is talking about, and like when I say that, I mean like a universally, like a theme that's found in all of Scripture, right? So, and then go see what the whole counsel of Scripture has to say about that, and then how that helps understand that one New Testament verse better. Is that kind of what we're going
You
for?
can do it that way, but that's actually more intertextuality. That's what I'm about to talk about. I would say canonical criticism is not so much about using other things to understand that one passage better, but it's using multiple passages on that theme to understand how the broad story of the Scripture illustrates that idea.
Okay.
Right? So the goal, it's a great question. Yes, I'm glad you asked it because it's clarifying. The goal would not be just to say, oh, look at here in Matthew 1, it says that Jesus is God with us. And then just going and looking at how the presence of God might help us understand that verse. It's instead to say, I'm interested in the broader theme of God's presence with us, and then giving equal weight to several passages across the Bible that tell the story of that concept, rather than only using the concept to translate or to interpret a single passage. Yeah.
So then that doesn't super work well for this class and the faculty, right? Because it's more so like digging into one specific passage.
No. I'm saying if you did it this way, you wouldn't have to just dig into one passage.
Okay.
You could do the canonical criticism approach if you do it well, by really showing how the New Testament more broadly fulfills a concept that's found throughout Scripture. I would be okay with that, and it wouldn't have to be about a single passage. I recommended people do their papers on a single passage only because it's more manageable to do that. But like the paper I mentioned that a student of mine wrote a couple of years ago on the Eden, prophecy of a new Eden and then consummation of a new Eden, he did not give pride of place to a single passage. He pretty evenly talked about how all those passages were leading along a narrative story through Israel's history and then into the church. So he culminated at the end of Revelation, but I wouldn't say he necessarily gave the end of Revelation more weight than Genesis or Isaiah. He was telling more of a broader story that just thankfully culminated in a New Testament text. Yeah, it's a good clarifying question. I do think the better approach most of the time is to pick a single text and just focus on that text because it's just manageable. You only have 3,500 words to about 4,000 words, right? And those words will vanish way faster than you think. They really will. Yeah, like I said, I've had people turning papers that were like 6,000, 7,000 words in the past because they just couldn't figure out how to do it shorter than that. And then I had to basically start telling students that I won't accept them anymore that are that long. I mean, I had one student, I said to her, this is 7,000 words. I'm going to take 10% off right off the top before I even read a word of it just because it's so long. Or you can go back and edit it down. So you can start with that full 100%, or I'm going to start you at 90% and start to move back from that if I have to read the 7,000 word version. And she found editing it so daunting that she was like, nope, take it as it is and I'll take the 10% off the top. Right, so it was such a well-written paper that she pulled she lost 4 points or something. So she pulled like an 86, but she would have had a 96 if she had written the same quality of a paper and done the editing. And it was just too daunting. She was like, I can't figure out what to take out. All of this is meaningful to me, and she just left it the way it was. So then I had to start telling people, I'm not taking these anymore. Way too long. But I say that to illustrate how difficult it is actually to write a short paper if you don't pick a very small, manageable topic, right? So it is a good question, Sam. I'm glad you asked it. This would be the one approach I would say that you could take a broader approach and tell a story through Scripture, but you'd have to do it really well. You'd have to keep verses in their context. That's, I guess, the point, right? Very good. All right, so our last little bit of time here, I'm going to talk a little bit about intertextuality. I'm going to skip some of the slides I have on it because we don't need most of them. So, intertextuality is essentially what we used to call, and some people still call, the New Testament use of the Old Testament. The reason why the longer, cumbersome phrase, New Testament use of the Old Testament, is now just called intertextuality in those circles is because intertextuality has become a broader conversation than only the New Testament using the Old Testament. For example, scholars are entirely convinced that in Romans chapter 1, Paul is aware of, influenced by, and engaging with portions of a non-biblical book called the Wisdom of Solomon. He's utilizing Wisdom of Solomon's language, and most scholars think that he's somewhat disagreeing with part of its worldview. So that if you've never read Wisdom of Solomon and you read Romans 1, you wouldn't notice or know that or care. And it probably doesn't affect our reading of Romans 1 a whole lot not to know this. And for most of us in this room, we probably read Romans 1 a whole lot, and that might be the first time you've ever even heard that. So I would say, first of all, your reading of Romans 1 is probably fine, right? But in the ancient world, Wisdom of Solomon was a wildly popular text, so that when they read Romans 1, they would have probably noticed right away that he's utilizing full phrases and terminology from the Wisdom of Solomon, and they would have seen the ways in which Paul is utilizing those phrases and somewhat turning them on their heads so that he could kind of critique and disagree with certain aspects of the worldview found in that text, right? But that's not the New Testament use of the Old Testament because Wisdom of Solomon isn't in the Old Testament. It's a Jewish text that was well known at the time, but it's not in the Bible. And so the New Testament use of the Old Testament needed to be expanded a bit when we started to have more realizations that there's more going on than just that one-to-one correlation between the two testaments. Another example of this would be that there's a psalm, a non-biblical psalm called the Wisdom of Solomon, which longs for and predicts the coming of a Messiah, and it uses a prediction of the coming of a Messiah in such a way that is meaningful to us and helpful to us to understand how people would have been shocked by the realization that Jesus was the Messiah, because he wasn't the kind of Messiah that the Jews who wrote Wisdom of Solomon were hoping for or expecting. So that's helpful because when we see Jesus being declared a Messiah by the gospel writers, we can kind of guess that they were thrown off by the identity of this Jesus as a Messiah, and like, wait a minute, you're not really what we were looking for. But if you read the Wisdom of Solomon, or the Psalms of Solomon, the 17th Psalm of Solomon, a non-biblical psalm, where they're talking about the coming of a Messiah and the need for one, and what they were hoping that that Messiah would do, and then you read the Gospels, you're like, oh, now I know exactly what they were looking for because they wrote about it. And I can read it, right? And now I can look at the expectation they had and what Jesus actually did, and I can compare it more fruitfully. That is intertextuality. Now, I'm not saying any of the Gospel writers embedded that psalm into their writing. I don't think they necessarily did. But they were aware of that psalm, almost certainly, because it was popular at the time. And so the gospel writers, Jesus himself, all would have been aware that there were expectations that they had and that Jesus came to be somewhat of a different Messiah than what they were thinking. Right? And that comparative analysis is a very fruitful analysis, I think, for that reason. There are, places like in Jude, where Jude does quote a non-biblical book, 1 Enoch, and tells us he's doing so. That's intertextuality, but that's not New Testament use of the Old Testament, because 1 Enoch, unless you're Ethiopian, isn't in your Old Testament. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church actually has 1 Enoch in their Bible. But nobody else does, right? But Jude quotes it. Favorably, by the way. He doesn't quote it to critique it, he quotes it because he agrees with it. So this kind of thing broadened our discussion on what it means to engage with the New Testament's use of antecedent text and traditions and ideas. And it doesn't even have to be a text. Intertextuality even includes like in-the-air ideas at the time. So for example, if you want to say, Paul talks a lot about the pneuma, the Holy Spirit. Well, the Stoics also believed in something they called the pneuma, and they talked about the pneuma in their writings all the time. They had very different ideas of what that was, but people in Paul's time would have been very aware that the Stoics also believed in something they called the pneuma. And when Paul then wrote about the pneuma, his very Gentile audience would have then thought, oh, well, the Stoics also have this pneuma thing, and they would have, in their minds, been comparing and contrasting. So for us, intertextuality is even just a comparative approach to maybe then that sort of thing. And by the way, lots of scholars have done that. There's a guy named Troels Enberg Peterson who's famous for it. I think he's too enamored with it. He spent a lot of time talking about comparative analysis between Paul's views of the Holy Spirit and the Stoic understanding of the pneuma, the Spirit. But all of this is intertextuality. It's how does the in-the-air concepts or different texts and ideas, how do they influence the way New Testament writers communicated and used language? Yeah.
And this would also refer to like Paul quoting the like Greek poets and stuff too, right?
Yeah, excellent example, right? In Acts, Paul refers to Greek poets, quotes them, so that he can use them as an illustration for his own preaching. That absolutely would be a form of intertextuality. How does he use the poets? How many of us have ever actually then tracked down the poets that Paul quotes to try to see what those poems are like and what they said? Here's a really good example that I think is super fascinating. One of my students last semester in the PhD course got really enamored with this question. When Luke talks about the shepherds in the field and the birth stories, Jesus, Luke talking about the shepherds in the field is quite similar to a poem, what's called a bucolic poem in Rome, where shepherds received a message of the birth of an emperor. Now, I don't believe that means that it was just a borrowing situation, that story isn't real. I believe it happened. But my point is, why did Luke choose that story rather than other stories? Remember, I talked last class about how Matthew has some birth stories and Luke has other ones, and they pick different stories. There's zero overlap. Well, Luke is writing almost entirely to a Gentile audience who would have been aware of this bucolic poem of the announcement of an emperor being made to shepherds in a field. So when Luke also then knows that these shepherds had this angelic vision and they went to attend to the birth of Jesus, he could have looked at that story and thought, aha, not only is this a story I can tell, but it's a story that my Gentile audience would be able to compare to their own emperor stories and go, oh wait, this is the real king, not the king that they have. Does that make sense? So there are scholars who have written about this and said maybe this is why Luke chose that story. That would be a form of intertextuality. So like I said, I had one student that got really enamored with that, and he went and read the bucolic poems and did a whole paper on analyzing the whole thing and trying to decide if that's why Luke picked the story and on and on and on. So yeah, good question. That's another great example of something like that. This typically includes the use of by New Testament writers in any sort of text, and now even cultural realities outside of standard texts, such as things like inscriptions, oral communications, common idioms, metaphors, songs. It includes the use of really any form of communication. So I also mentioned in our last class the idea of adoption. Paul only uses adoption terminology in Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians, nowhere else. And those are the 3 letters he wrote to places where the practice of Roman adoption was the most common. So even that can be a form of intertextuality, because you could do a little bit of work on how did Roman adoption work? When did they adopt? Why did they adopt? And based on that, how would they then have received the idea that the God of the universe has adopted you, right? That cultural reality can be a form of intertextuality if you actually look at texts in the Roman world where they describe adoption practices, and there are quite a few of them. Just as a quick note to that, in Rome they did not adopt babies. So the entire idea that you would compare it to our modern adoption doesn't work, because our modern adoption is like you take parents who don't have a kid and a kid who doesn't have parents, and you pair them together. And it's quite beautiful. It's all about love and the expression of family and the desire to share your life with another and that sort of thing. Almost none of that had anything to do with adoption in the Roman world. Adoption in the Roman world was almost entirely about the preservation of an estate and about economics. So in Rome, adults adopted other adults. They adopted other adults if they needed to pass on their estate to a qualified candidate but didn't have anyone to pass it on to. And the reason you would only adopt another adult is because that's how you knew they were ready and qualified to take your stuff and do well with it. There are whole texts by ancient Roman philosophers where they talk about stories of like a rich person saying, oh, hey, I adopted so-and-so because he was a swell guy and I thought he would multiply my estate in my death. So that, and by the way, about half of the Roman emperors were adopted by their predecessors. And some of them had children and denied their own children the throne and adopted somebody from outside of the family to pass on the throne in the face of already having natural born children. And so, by the way, we have an example of this in the movie Gladiator. Anyone? Gladiator? They don't use the word adoption, but actually legally, Marcus Aurelius would have had to legally adopt the general Maximus to be able to pass on the throne to him. And Marcus Aurelius had a son, Commodus. And he looked at Commodus and he was like, not this guy, right? That's a bad idea. Maximus, I'm going to make you the emperor instead. In Rome, he legally would have had to adopt him as his child in order to pass the throne on. But it wasn't just about emperors. All adoptions in ancient Rome essentially were like that. It was who's qualified to be my heir, and that's when you would adopt someone. So when God adopts us, why is that shocking? Because the adoption passages in Paul's letters are in the context of us all being former slaves to sin. And who in the Roman world would you never adopt?
A slave.
A slave or a former slave. So it's like Paul's thing is like, hey guys, hint, hint. You know how in the Roman world, again, I'm reading between the lines. You know, in the Roman world, emperors only adopt other people to be the next emperor because they're ready and qualified, ethically upstanding, etc. You know how rich people adopt other rich people because they got stuff to pass on, but all of their children either died in infancy or they're morons and they don't want to give their stuff to their moron children. Well, God looks at you and instead says, you're not qualified for this at all. You guys were all slaves to sin and completely lost. And it's only because of love, according to Romans 8:31-39, only because of my love for you that I'm going to pull you out of slavery to sin and adopt you as my child, despite the fact you're very much not qualified for it. So Paul takes the entire adoption concept and just flips it on its head. Engaging with Roman texts on how they did it and then looking at how Paul talked about it could be a form of intertextuality. Yeah.
This example about adoption, would this not be considered historical criticism or traditional
It would be actually a blend of all. Well, maybe not as much the traditional one, but yeah, it would be historical criticism and I think intertextuality blended together. Historical criticism, if you're only talking about the historical realities, but where intertextuality would come in, is if you found texts where they talked about adoption and used them meaningfully in your analysis, it would be, and by the way, most of these, I'm glad you asked that question because I don't think I've said this clearly and I should have. A lot of these can be combined into approaches where you're using sort of hybrid forms of a lot of these approaches all together as one. So it's a great question. Yeah. So that would be a little bit of historical criticism, intertextuality, all molded into a single approach if you did something like that. You could do this with texts where one text uses another text, or you could do it with ideas. So for example, I wrote my first book on inheritance in the Bible, and there are New Testament writers. I focused on Matthew, but Paul also writes on inheritance a lot. There are writers in the New Testament who talk a lot about inheritance as sort of a theological concept. That not only are you adopted by God, but you're adopted to what? Receive an inheritance, which does fit the Roman context, and that's why they adopted back then. You also then receive an inheritance. But inheritance was not just a Roman concept, it was also a Jewish one. Adoption wasn't. The Jews didn't have a formal adoption policy, so they only would have read that probably through the lens of the Roman system. I mean, you did have Jews adopting people, but they didn't have a formal adoption practice. They wouldn't have called it adoption. They had no word for adoption in ancient Israel. Like, adoption in ancient Israel is more just like, Joshua's parents died and somebody needs to take him in. But it wasn't like, they didn't think of it as formal adoption in the way that Romans would or we would, right? So that's probably more what Paul had in mind, because the word he uses for it is only found in Greek and Roman texts. It's not found anywhere in Israel's text. But inheritance was found in both cultures. It was found in Israel's culture and in the Greco-Roman culture. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be a single text, but if you wanted to do like a study on a concept like that, and ways in which you can intertextually link what's being said in one text with another text on that topic, something like that could work really well. So there's a lot of ways to approach this sort of a way to do it. So the three most common types of usage include quotations, allusions, and echoes. I have 9 minutes. I'm going to try to do these three really quickly, but they're relatively self-explanatory, I think. Let's skip. Quotations just begin with formulas. They indicate themselves, right? That the word might be fulfilled. Matthew uses that one. So that the scripture might be fulfilled. John uses that one. For David says, Acts quotes David by saying, for as David says, so you know it's a quote, right? As it is written, Romans 1:17. It is testified somewhere saying, I'm not even trying to like figure out where, just, I heard somewhere this, right? That's in Hebrews. And we all do that, by the way, right? I read a book many years ago about how a lot of the time where we go, I remember this, I wonder where this idiom came from, or who said this? And the large number of those that all go back to Shakespeare.
Yeah, right.
Somebody wrote a whole book on like hundreds of idioms that not only go back to him in terms of being popularized, but that he literally invented idioms that are still 400 years later wildly popular, and no one knows where they came from. Well, that's where, over and over and over again, right? Some simply begin with an indirect marker, such as for or that, but it indicates that they're moving into a quote of a Hebrew Bible passage or something like that. So these formulas usually help us to indicate that a quote is taking place. Quotes are used prolifically in the New Testament, and they don't even exhaust the New Testament's use of the Hebrew Bible. But the quotes are still all over the place. Some even have no indicator, but can be detected by just verbatim word agreement, right? Like in Matthew 5:5, when Jesus quotes Psalm 37, he doesn't indicate that he's quoting Psalm 37, but he quotes it verbatim. Like, it's obvious that that's where he got it, right? So sometimes there's no indicator, but you can just tell because it's a whole stack of words that are identical to this other passage, so that it's obvious that that's where it is. Yeah, I don't want to get into this, but there's a debate about how much word agreement is necessary to be a quote rather than something other than a quote, like an allusion. That doesn't really matter for your purposes of reading it well or interpreting it at all. Yeah, so allusions. Allusions are more like a reference to another text in which no quote is found, but the reference is still pretty detectable. Paul alludes to the Abrahamic promise in a couple of places where he both quotes portions of Genesis, but then also alludes to other portions he doesn't quote. The quotes are easier to find because they're quotes, but there are allusions where it's like, oh, but he also has Genesis 22 in mind here. He doesn't quote it, but it seems pretty obvious that's what he means, right? So when it talks about, at the end of Romans 8, when it says that the Father was willing to give up the Son, most scholars think that that's an allusion to Abraham's willingness to give up his own son in Genesis. Paul doesn't quote the Abrahamic story, but it seems relatively clear to most scholars that there's an allusion there between the two. So allusions, again, are just, you're pretty sure that they're talking about bringing in a story, even if they're not quoting it word for word. Like the Hall of Faith. It's not quoting a lot of those Hebrew Bible stories, but it's mentioning the names of people littered all over the Hebrew Scriptures, and so you can go to those stories and then figure out what stories they're probably alluding to. Jesus' reference to Jonah in Matthew 12 doesn't quote Jonah particularly, but it's very obvious he has certain parts of that story in mind. The allusion is strong enough that you can go and figure it out. This is important, though, really important, and I gotta say this quickly. Scholars often debate the nature of an allusion by warning against either parallelomania or parallelophobia, and here's what those two words mean. Parallelomania means finding allusions all over the place that aren't really there because you're enamored with looking for them. Like, oh, well, this probably refers to that, like you're code cracking or something. And that gets exhausting and obnoxious and leads to people taking verses out of context all the time. Like, just because you think something's there doesn't mean it's there. You have to be careful. So parallelomania is, tentatively approaching a possible illusion and doing the hard work to figure out if it's really there. But parallelophobia is the opposite, which happens to scholars a lot, where unless it's a quote, they're almost too hesitant to look for an illusion, and they don't want to do it because they don't want to make a mistake, when in reality, the writer might have really had that story on the brain, and we need to be able to be open to that possibility. So, for example, that one I just mentioned in Romans 8, where Paul seems to kind of be clearly alluding to the Abraham-Isaac story, there are some scholars who deny that that's there because Paul doesn't quote the story. So they go, no, I don't think Paul has this on his mind at all, and I think it's parallelomania. You're looking for something that's not there. I think I agree with the scholars that think that Paul was, in fact, thinking of that story. I think the allusion's strong enough. Parallelophobia is kind of this ultra hesitancy of like, unless it's a quote, I'm not going to go there. And I think we need to be more open to these parallels, right, without taking them too far and looking for them around every corner. And then finally, there are what's called echoes. These ones can get quite dangerous, though, which are even less direct than allusions. Subtle clues are given of faint resonances to these antecedent references. These include words or phrases that might invoke memories or ideas of previous ideas, but often intentionally for the sake of building meaning through connection. So, I have an example there from Matthew 5. I don't have time to go through it, but like what Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." That word he uses for peacemakers, it's called a hapax legomena. It's the only time in the entire Bible that word is used. That exact word for peacemakers is found in 0 other places. So what we do then is we try to find faint hints of other places where other versions of words for peace are found, which are everywhere. And then we try to say how much of this might have been on Jesus' mind when he told us to be peacemakers. And to some degree, that's helpful because we need to figure out what he meant. And to some degree, it's unhelpful because he didn't mean all of it. He didn't mean like every single time the word peace is ever found in the biblical text that he includes all of that in what he means, right? So echoes you have to track them maybe to a point to help identify meaning, but it can get real dicey real quick if you overdo it, right? Echoes are probably there in a lot of texts, but like there's an argument that my PhD student made that did his doctorate. He finished last year, David Hong. He has an argument where in Philippians 1, Paul echoes Job. And when he first proposed it, I told him I wasn't sure it was there. And by the time he finished making his argument, he had entirely convinced me that it is. Right? So it's just really being careful with the work and figuring out whether an echo is there or not. I have a whole criteria for detecting echoes I'm not going to get into today. It's not mine. Richard Hayes proposed it. It's very long. I'm going to stop there with those. because a lot of you won't even do intertextuality, although I would encourage you all, as I said earlier, that intertextuality is so much more prolifically found in New Testament writings than we realize, that no matter what passage you decide to use or topic, you're going to have to at least think, is this writer in this text engaging with something that came before? You should be, every one of you should ask that question of whatever you decide to do. Is this meaningfully engaging with something that came before? Because it's done way more often than you might realize. And if you want more on how to do that well, I can either go through those slides I just decided not to go through, or there's a couple of very brief books that explain this very well that I can give you. For those of you online, the video is about to shut off, but we're done. In the room, any final questions about any of that?